The autumn rain drummed against the windows of the St. Augustine Historical Research Center as Dr. Sarah Chen worked alone in the conservation lab. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her workstation where a brittle photograph lay, its silver gelatin emulsion crackling under her careful touch. 6 young men, brothers, according to the faded inscription, stood before what appeared to be a phosphate mine in central Florida. The date read 1878, written in careful script. The photograph had arrived 3 weeks earlier from the estate of Margaret Holloway, found sealed in a leather portfolio, hidden in a false bottom of an antique trunk. Sarah adjusted her magnifying lamp. The 6 brothers ranged from perhaps 16 to 30, bearing the same sharp features. Their rough canvas trousers and clay-stained shirts marked them as working men, but their expressions made her hair stand up. While typical photographs of that era showed stoic faces, these men displayed something visceral. Fear, pure, undisguised fear. The youngest brother, standing at the far left, had his hand raised slightly, as if reaching toward the camera, his mouth open mid-word. The oldest, positioned in the center, gripped the shoulder of the man beside him so tightly that his knuckles appeared white, even in the aged photograph. Their eyes, all 12 of them, seemed to stare not at the camera, but through it, fixed on something beyond the lens that the photographer had not captured. Sarah had seen thousands of 19th-century photographs in her career. She knew the limitations of the technology, the chemical processes that could create strange artifacts, the way silver salts could degrade over time to produce unusual effects. But this was different. This was intentional. These men were terrified of something, and someone had documented that terror with deliberate precision. She turned the photograph over again, studying the inscription more carefully under magnification. The handwriting was elegant, educated, belonging to someone with means and learning. It read, "The Mercer Brothers, Bone Valley, March 1878. 6 entered. None returned. Let this stand as testimony." Below that, in different ink and a shakier hand, someone had added years later, "The truth must never surface. Bury this deep. Bury it forever." A chill ran down her spine. She opened the database of Florida historical records. The Bone Valley region had been the heart of Florida's phosphate boom in the late 19th century, drawing thousands of desperate workers to brutal conditions. She typed, "Mercer Brothers, Bone Valley, 1878, and waited. Nothing. She tried variations, still nothing. It was as if the 6 men had never existed. Sarah glanced at the clock. 8:30 p.m. She should go home, but something about the photograph held her. She began the restoration process, carefully cleaning and stabilizing the emulsion. As she worked, she found her mind wandering to the implications of the inscriptions. 6 entered, none returned. Entered what? The mine. And if none returned, who took the photograph? Who wrote the testimony? The handwriting suggested education and resources, someone who had been there, who had witnessed whatever happened to these brothers. The second inscription troubled her even more. The truth must never surface. Bury this deep. That was a warning, or perhaps a plea. Someone had known the story behind this photograph and had made a conscious decision to hide it, yet they had not destroyed it. Instead, they had preserved it, sealed it away, as if unable to completely erase the evidence, but equally unable to let it be known. Sarah's phone buzzed, startling her. A text from her colleague, Marcus Williams, who worked in the archaeology department. "Still at the office? Want to grab a late dinner?" She typed back, "Working on something interesting. Rain check? Always working. Be careful going home. Weather's getting nasty." Sarah smiled despite herself. Marcus worried about everyone, a trait that made him excellent at his job, excavating Native American sites along the coast. His attention to detail and care for preservation mirrored her own approach to archival work. She returned her attention to the photograph, beginning the painstaking process of surface cleaning with a soft brush and specialized solutions. As she worked, more details emerged from beneath decades of accumulated grime and oxidation. In the background, barely visible, she could make out the entrance to a mine shaft, a dark opening in the earth surrounded by rough timber supports. To the right, partially obscured by damage to the photograph, stood another figure, this one in a formal suit and hat, holding what appeared to be a ledger or notebook. Sarah increased the magnification on her lamp, focusing on this seventh figure. Unlike the six brothers, this man was smiling, not a pleasant smile, but something predatory, satisfied. And his hand, the one not holding the ledger, was pointing directly at the mine entrance. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, and Sarah looked up, frowning. The electrical system in this old building was constantly acting up, but usually not in this section. The lights steadied, and she returned to her work, making detailed notes about every aspect of the photograph for the digital archive. As the night deepened, Sarah became increasingly absorbed in her task. She carefully documented the type of photographic paper, the chemical processes used, the unique characteristics of the image. Everything suggested that this was an authentic period photograph, professionally produced, not some amateur's attempt. Whoever had taken this image had been skilled, had access to quality equipment and materials. The composition was too precise, the lighting too carefully controlled, for this to be anything but deliberate documentation. But documentation of what? By midnight, Sarah had completed the initial cleaning and stabilization. Tomorrow, she would begin the digital scanning process, creating high-resolution images that would allow her to examine every microscopic detail. She carefully placed the photograph in an acid-free archival folder, sealed it in the climate-controlled storage vault, and gathered her things to leave. The building felt different at night, its usual bustling energy replaced by an oppressive silence, broken only by the rain and the occasional creak of old wood settling. Sarah had worked late countless times before and had never felt uneasy. But tonight, something felt wrong. As she walked down the corridor toward the exit, she found herself glancing over her shoulder, unable to shake the sensation of being watched. The security guard, Tom Ramirez, looked up as she approached. Retired police, 62, kind but lonely. "Burning the midnight oil again, Dr. Chen?" "You know me, Tom. When I find something interesting, I can't let it go." "What's got your attention tonight?" Sarah hesitated. "An old photograph. 6 brothers who disappeared in 1878. Tom's expression changed subtly. 1878. Some stories are meant to stay buried. "You sound like the person who wrote on the photograph," Sarah said. "My grandmother told me stories about the old phosphate mines," Tom replied seriously. "Terrible things happened. Powerful families wanted them forgotten. She said the earth is soaked with secrets, and digging them up brings trouble." Sarah felt a chill. "Tom, that's superstition." "Maybe. My grandmother lost family in those mines. They went to work and never came home. No bodies, no explanations. The mining companies had more power than the law back then." Sarah signed out on Tom's log, disturbed by the conversation. "I'm just trying to preserve history, Tom. These men deserve to be remembered." "Remembered, sure," Tom said. "But some things, once you start pulling on that thread, the whole tapestry comes unraveled, and you might not like what you find underneath." Sarah drove home through the rain, Tom's words echoing in her mind. Her apartment was in the historic district, a small but comfortable space above a bookstore on St. George Street. The tourist crowds had long since dispersed for the night, leaving the colonial streets empty and glistening with rain. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, her phone rang. Unknown number, local area code. "Dr. Chen?" The voice was elderly, female, refined. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I need to speak with you about a particular photograph. Sarah's grip tightened. How did you know about that? That photograph should never have been found. There are families in this city who have gone to great lengths to ensure certain aspects of our history remain private. I'm calling to warn you. Are you threatening me? I'm trying to protect you. My family has connections to the Holloway estate. We've kept certain truths buried for generations. What happened to those 6 men involves families who still have considerable influence. Families who will not appreciate having their ancestors' crimes exposed. So, there were crimes, Sarah said. A pause. Dr. Chen, I beg you, destroy that photograph. Forget you ever saw it. The alternative will bring you nothing but pain. I'm a historian. I don't destroy evidence. Then God help you, Eleanor said, and hung up. Sarah stood in her apartment, phone still in hand, mind racing. The call had been meant to frighten her, to make her back down, but it had done the opposite. Now she knew for certain that the photograph represented something significant, something that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. The 6 Mercer brothers had not simply died in a mining accident. Something else had happened, something deliberate, something that families with influence had been concealing for nearly a century and a half. She sat down at her laptop and began searching deeper, using academic databases and genealogical records, cross-referencing names and dates. If the Mercer brothers had existed, they would have left some trace, some footprint in the historical record. Birth records, census data, land deeds, anything. Hours passed. The rain continued to fall, and slowly, piece by piece, Sarah began to find fragments. A notation in an 1870 census record for Polk County showing 6 brothers with the surname Mercer, ages ranging from 8 to 22. Their parents were listed as deceased, and they were living with an uncle who worked as a foreman at a phosphate operation. She found another reference in a newspaper from 1877, a small article about labor unrest at a mine in Bone Valley. Several workers had complained about dangerous conditions, long hours, wages paid in scrip rather than cash that could only be redeemed at the company store. Among the names of workers who had signed a petition demanding better treatment were 3 with the surname Mercer. The pieces were coming together. The brothers had been laborers, had been among those who had dared to challenge the mining companies. And then, in March of 1878, they had disappeared. Sarah kept searching, and finally, near 3 in the morning, she found something that made her blood run cold. A death notice in a Tampa newspaper dated April 1878, but not for the Mercer brothers. For their uncle, the foreman. He had been found dead in his home, an apparent suicide, though the article noted that some local residents questioned this conclusion. The house had been burned shortly after, destroying any evidence. The pattern was becoming clear. The brothers had agitated for workers' rights. They had been silenced. Their uncle, perhaps knowing what had happened, had been eliminated to prevent him from talking. And the photograph, that careful documentation of 6 terrified men standing before a mine entrance, had been preserved by someone as a silent accusation, a testimony that could not be spoken aloud but refused to be completely erased. Sarah finally went to bed as dawn approached, but sleep was elusive. When it came, it brought dreams of dark mine shafts and the sound of earth collapsing, of men screaming in darkness, of powerful hands sealing the entrance to a tomb. While above ground, someone carefully composed a photograph and wrote an inscription that would survive for generations. Sarah woke to her phone ringing at 9 a.m., her head foggy from too little sleep and dreams that clung to her consciousness like cobwebs. The caller ID showed the Historical Research Center. She answered to find Marcus Williams on the other end, his usually calm voice carrying an edge of concern. "Sarah, you need to come in right away. Something's happened." She sat up, instantly alert. "What is it?" The storage vault. Someone broke in last night. They were very selective about what they took. Sarah's heart sank. The Holloway collection? How did you know? 20 minutes later, Sarah stood in the conservation lab, staring at the open vault door. Tom Ramirez stood nearby, his face pale and drawn. The police had already been and gone, taking statements, dusting for fingerprints, reviewing security footage. The break-in had occurred at 4:30 a.m., nearly 90 minutes after Sarah had left. The intruder had been professional. They had entered through a second-floor window that faced an alley, bypassing the alarm system with knowledge that suggested either an inside job or extensive reconnaissance. They had gone directly to the vault, used some kind of sophisticated tool to bypass the lock without triggering additional alarms, and removed exactly 3 items from the Holloway collection. The photograph of the 6 brothers, a leather-bound journal that Sarah had not yet had time to examine, and a small metal box containing what the inventory described as personal correspondence. "The security footage," Sarah said to Tom. "Did it show anything?" Tom shook his head, his distress evident. "That's the strangest part. The cameras in this hallway, they all went offline at exactly 4:25 a.m. Static, like something was jamming them. They came back online at 4:40, and by then the intruder was gone. The cameras outside didn't catch anyone entering or leaving. It's like they vanished." Detective James Morrison, a man in his 50s with the weathered face of someone who had seen too much, closed his notebook and addressed Sarah. "Dr. Chen, I understand you were the last person to handle these items. Can you think of any reason someone would specifically target this collection?" Sarah hesitated. She could tell him about the phone call from Eleanor Whitmore, about the inscriptions on the photograph, about her late-night research into the Mercer brothers. But something held her back, an instinct that this went deeper than a simple theft, that involving the police might put her in more danger rather than less. "The Holloway estate was substantial," she said carefully. "These items had historical value, but not significant monetary worth. It doesn't make sense as a robbery. Unless someone wanted to make sure those items stayed hidden," Marcus interjected. He had been standing quietly in the corner, but now he stepped forward. "Dr. Chen told me she was researching a photograph from 1878. What if someone didn't want that research to continue?" Detective Morrison's eyes narrowed. "Are you suggesting this was about suppressing historical information? In my experience, Dr. Williams, people don't commit break-ins over old photographs. They do it for money, drugs, or to cover up current crimes." "Maybe some crimes never stop being current," Marcus said. "Maybe some families have been covering up the same crime for generations." The detective looked between them, clearly skeptical, but unable to completely dismiss the idea. "If you think you're in danger, Dr. Chen, we can provide protection." "I appreciate that," Sarah said. "But I think this was about the documents, not about me. They got what they wanted. I doubt they'll be back." She didn't believe that, and from the look Marcus gave her, neither did he. But she needed time to think, to figure out her next move without the police watching her every step. After Morrison left, promising to keep her updated on the investigation, Sarah and Marcus stood alone in the lab. The violation of the space felt physical, as if someone had reached into her work, her passion, and torn something vital away. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" Marcus asked. "They stole evidence of a crime," Sarah said. "A crime that happened in 1878, but a crime nonetheless. Those 6 men disappeared, Marcus. They were murdered, I'm sure of it now, and someone went to enormous trouble to make sure no one would ever prove it. Sarah, whoever did this, they broke into a secured facility in the middle of the night. They have resources, connections. You're a historian, not a detective. Maybe you should step back from this." She turned to him, and he must have seen something in her expression because he sighed and held up his hands in surrender. "Or not," he said. Okay, so you're going to keep investigating. At least let me help. Two sets of eyes are better than one, and I'd rather be with you than worrying about you from a distance. Sarah felt a surge of gratitude. Thank you. But Marcus, this could get dangerous. That phone call I got last night, it wasn't random. Someone knew I had that photograph within hours of me handling it. Either we have a leak here at the center, or these people have very sophisticated surveillance capabilities. Or both, Marcus said grimly. So where do we start? We start with what they couldn't steal, Sarah said, moving to her computer. Before I left last night, I had already uploaded some preliminary scans of the photograph to our cloud storage. Not high resolution, but enough to work with. And I made detailed notes about everything I observed. She pulled up the files, and they spent the next hour examining every detail of the scanned image. Marcus proved to have an excellent eye for detail, pointing out aspects Sarah had missed in her initial examination. The seventh figure in the background, the well-dressed man with the predatory smile, wore a ring on his right hand that was visible even in the degraded scan. It appeared to be a signet ring, possibly bearing a family crest or organizational symbol. "Can you enhance this section?" Marcus asked. Sarah worked with the image editing software, increasing contrast and sharpening the details. Slowly, the ring's design became clearer. It showed what appeared to be a phosphate rock surrounded by laurel leaves, with letters that might be initials below. "I've seen that symbol before," Marcus said slowly. "At the museum. There's a display about Florida's phosphate industry, and one of the historical panels shows the founding companies. Let me check." He pulled out his phone and began searching through the museum's online collection. After a few minutes, he found it. Here, the Consolidated Phosphate Trust, formed in 1875 by a group of wealthy investors from Tampa and Jacksonville. They controlled most of the mining operations in Central Florida for decades. The company logo, look at this, was identical to that ring design. Sarah felt pieces clicking into place. The man in the photograph worked for Consolidated. He might have been management or an owner, and if the Mercer brothers were agitating against the company, demanding better conditions. The company had motive to silence them, Marcus finished. But would they really murder 6 men? In 1878, labor was cheap and plentiful. Why not just fire them? Unless it wasn't about labor disputes, Sarah said. What if the brothers discovered something the company couldn't risk becoming public? They looked at each other, both understanding that they were venturing into speculation. But sometimes, Sarah knew, speculation was the first step toward uncovering truth. "We need to find out more about Consolidated Phosphate Trust," Sarah said. "Corporate records, ownership structures, what happened to the company, and we need to figure out who that 7th man in the photograph was." Marcus nodded. "I have a contact at the State Archives in Tallahassee. They have extensive business records from that era. I can make some calls. See what they have on Consolidated." "Good. And I'm going to track down Eleanor Whitmore. She called me last night, warned me to destroy the photograph. She mentioned family connections to the Holloway estate. If she's worried about protecting her family's reputation, that means her ancestors were involved somehow." "Be careful with that," Marcus warned. "If her family has been covering this up for generations, confronting her directly might be dangerous." "I'll be discreet," Sarah promised, though she wasn't sure how discreet she could be when essentially accusing someone's ancestors of murder. They worked through the afternoon, each pursuing their separate research paths. Sarah used genealogical databases to trace the Whitmore family tree, discovering that Eleanor Whitmore was indeed connected to the Holloway line through marriage. Her great-grandmother had been Margaret Holloway's aunt, and the Whitmore family had been wealthy phosphate magnates in the late 19th century. More significantly, her great-great-grandfather, Charles Whitmore, had been one of the founding partners of Consolidated Phosphate Trust. The connection was clear. Eleanor Whitmore's ancestor had been involved with the company at the exact time the Mercer brothers disappeared. No wonder she had wanted the photograph destroyed. As evening approached, Sarah's phone rang again. This time, she recognized the number. Tom Ramirez. "Dr. Chen, I need to talk to you. Not at the center, somewhere private." They agreed to meet at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, away from the tourist areas and the historical district. Sarah drove there as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too beautiful for the dark subject matter occupying her thoughts. Tom was already there, sitting in a corner booth with a cup of coffee growing cold in front of him. He looked as if he had aged 10 years since that morning, his face drawn and his eyes haunted. "Thank you for coming," he said as Sarah slid into the seat across from him. "I didn't know who else to talk to." "What's wrong, Tom?" He glanced around the nearly empty cafe, then leaned forward. "After the police left this morning, I started thinking about what happened. The break-in was too professional, too clean. And the way the cameras went down, that takes specific equipment, specific knowledge. So I did something I probably shouldn't have. I reviewed all the security footage from the past month, looking for anything unusual. And 3 weeks ago, the same day the Holloway collection arrived at the center, a man came to the building. He said he was from the insurance company, needed to inspect our security system for policy renewal. I let him in, watched him check the cameras, the vault, everything. He spent about an hour here, very thorough, very professional. I thought nothing of it at the time." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "You think he was casing the place?" "I know he was," Tom said, "because I called our insurance company this afternoon. They never sent anyone. That man, whoever he was gathering information for the break-in. And Dr. Chen, here's the thing that terrifies me. I looked at the security footage from when he was here. I got a clear view of his face, so I did an internet search, used that reverse image technology." He pulled out his phone, hands shaking slightly, and showed Sarah a photograph. The man was in his 40s, fit and professional-looking, with cold eyes and a neutral expression, the kind of face that could disappear in a crowd. "His name is Derek Sutton," Tom continued. "Ex-military, specialized in intelligence and security. After he left the service, he started a private consulting firm. They do security work, corporate espionage, problem-solving for wealthy clients, the kind of firm that doesn't advertise but has clients who pay premium rates for discretion." "You're saying someone hired him to steal the photograph?" "I'm saying someone hired him to make sure that photograph and anything related to it disappeared. And Dr. Chen, I looked into his company's client list, the public parts of it anyway. One of their biggest retainers comes from the Whitmore Family Trust. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Eleanor Whitmore had not called Sarah out of concern or courtesy. She had been assessing the situation, determining if Sarah could be scared off with a warning. When that failed, she had activated her contingency plan, sending in a professional to retrieve the evidence. "Tom, why are you telling me this? You could lose your job for digging into this." "Because my grandmother was right," Tom said, his voice heavy with old pain. "Terrible things happened in those mines, and powerful families buried the truth. But she was wrong about one thing. She thought the past should stay buried to protect people. I think the opposite. I think the past needs to be exposed, dragged into the light, so that those powerful families can finally face consequences for what their ancestors did." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a USB drive, sliding it across the table to Sarah. "This contains all the security footage I could access, including clear images of Derek Sutton. If anything happens to me, or if anyone tries to delete this from the center's servers, you'll still have evidence. Tom, if the Whitmores find out you helped me, I'm an old man, Dr. Chen. I've got maybe 10 good years left if I'm lucky. I'd rather spend them knowing I did the right thing than spend them keeping someone else's evil secrets." He stood up, leaving money on the table for his untouched coffee. Be careful. These people, they don't play by normal rules. They've been hiding this for nearly 150 years. They won't stop now just because one historian is asking questions. Sarah watched him leave, then looked down at the USB drive in her hand. She had physical evidence now, proof that someone had actively worked to suppress information about the Mercer brothers. But evidence of what exactly? A break-in, certainly. But connecting that to events from 1878 would require more than security footage and family connections. She needed to find the story behind the photograph, to understand what had really happened to those 6 men, and she knew where to start looking. If Margaret Holloway had preserved that photograph for decades, hiding it in a secret compartment in her ancestor's trunk, she must have had other documents, other pieces of the puzzle. The Holloway mansion still stood overlooking Matanzas Bay, currently in probate as the estate was settled. But Sarah knew the Historical Society had the right to examine any remaining documents or artifacts before the property was sold. Tomorrow, she would request access to the house, to search for whatever Margaret had left behind. As she drove home through the darkness, Sarah could not shake the feeling that she was being watched. Several times, she thought she saw the same set of headlights following her, maintaining a careful distance. When she pulled into her parking space behind the bookstore, the lights drove past without stopping, but she remained in her car for several minutes, heart pounding, before gathering the courage to go inside. Her apartment felt different that night, less like a sanctuary and more like a trap. She wedged a chair under the doorknob, something she had never done before, and set her phone to record continuously, placing it where it could capture anyone entering while she slept. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by every sound, every creak of old wood, every footstep from the street below. And when she did sleep, she dreamed again of the mine shaft, of 6 men being forced underground at gunpoint, of the entrance being sealed with explosives while their screams echoed in the darkness, of a well-dressed man with a predatory smile writing carefully in his ledger, documenting the disposal of troublesome labor as casually as one might record a business transaction. She woke before dawn, drenched in sweat, the dream still vivid in her mind. But as she lay there in the grey light, she realized something important. The dream had not been just her imagination. It had been her subconscious assembling the facts, creating a narrative that fit the evidence. And if she was right, the 6 Mercer brothers had not simply disappeared. They had been murdered in the most horrific way possible, buried alive in a mine shaft, and their deaths had been deliberately concealed by men with power and money who saw human life as nothing more than an expendable resource in the pursuit of profit. Now, nearly 150 years later, Sarah Chen was going to prove it, and she was going to make sure that the families who had benefited from that crime finally faced the truth of what their ancestors had done. The Holloway mansion loomed against the morning sky like a monument to old money and older secrets. Built in 1892, the 3-story Victorian structure commanded a prime position on the bay, its elaborate gingerbread trim and wraparound porches, speaking of an era when phosphate wealth had transformed Florida's pioneers into industrial aristocrats. Sarah stood before the ornate iron gates, clutching the access authorization from the Historical Society, feeling as if she were about to enter a tomb. The estate lawyer, a thin man named Gerald Prescott, who clearly resented being pulled away from his office on a Saturday morning, unlocked the gates with obvious reluctance. The Historical Society has until the end of the month to document any items of interest, he said in a voice that suggested he considered this a waste of everyone's time. After that, the property goes to auction. The heirs want nothing to do with it. Margaret Holloway had no family, Sarah asked as they walked up the crushed shell pathway to the front entrance. Distant cousins, third and fourth generation removed. None of them even attended the funeral. Prescott unlocked the massive front door, its wood dark with age and polish. Truth be told, Ms. Holloway was something of a recluse in her final years. People said she was haunted by family ghosts, though I suspect it was just the loneliness of outliving everyone who mattered to her. The interior of the mansion was a museum of 19th-century opulence. Heavy furniture, oil paintings in gilded frames, Persian rugs that muffled their footsteps. But unlike most historic homes preserved in Aspic, this one felt lived in, human. Books lay open on side tables, reading glasses perched on their pages. A half-finished crossword puzzle sat beside a teacup on the parlor desk. The traces of Margaret Holloway's final days remained, as if she had simply stepped out for a moment and would return at any time. "I'll need access to her private study," Sarah said, "and any storage areas where documents might have been kept." Prescott checked his watch impatiently. "The study is on the second floor, third door on the left. I have other appointments today, Dr. Chen. How long will this take?" "As long as necessary," Sarah said firmly. "The Historical Society's authorization gives me access for the entire day if needed." The lawyer's expression soured, but he nodded. "I'll be downstairs in the kitchen if you need anything. Try not to disturb more than necessary." Sarah climbed the grand staircase, her hand trailing along the mahogany banister worn smooth by generations of hands. Family portraits lined the wall, faces from different eras, staring down with varying expressions of pride, severity, or melancholy. She paused before one dated 1890, showing a young couple in formal dress. The brass plate identified them as Edmund and Catherine Holloway, Margaret's great-grandparents. Edmund Holloway's face was unremarkable, prosperous and self-satisfied, the face of a man who had never questioned his right to wealth and position. But Catherine's eyes held something else, a sadness, a knowledge of something terrible. Sarah wondered if she had known about the Mercer brothers, about what her husband's business partners had done in pursuit of profit. The study was exactly what Sarah had hoped for, a treasure trove of family documents. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled with leather-bound volumes, photograph albums, and document boxes carefully labeled by year. A massive desk dominated the center of the room, its surface cluttered with more recent papers, bills, and correspondence from Margaret's final months. Sarah began systematically, starting with the oldest documents and working forward. She found business ledgers from the Consolidated Phosphate Trust, carefully recording tonnage extracted, prices paid, profits earned. The numbers were staggering. In the peak years of the 1880s and 1890s, the company had generated wealth equivalent to hundreds of millions in modern dollars. But it was the subsidiary ledgers that made Sarah's blood run cold. Buried in the back of a document box marked 1878, she found what appeared to be a second set of books, unofficial accounts recording expenses that would never have been included in the public records, payments to local law enforcement for looking the other way during labor disputes, bribes to county officials to ignore safety violations, and on a page dated March 1878, a notation that made Sarah's hands shake as she photographed it with her phone. Disposal of agitators. Bone Valley operation. 6 units. Permanent solution implemented. Cost $300. Paid to J. Morrison for services rendered. 6 units. Not 6 men, not 6 human beings with names and families and lives. 6 units disposed of like malfunctioning machinery for the cost of $300. Sarah sat back, fighting nausea. Here was the proof, documented in the cold language of accounting. The Mercer brothers had been murdered, and it had been treated as a routine business expense. She kept searching, finding more pieces of the puzzle. Letters between Edmund Holloway and his business partners, discussing the need to maintain discipline among the workforce, to make examples of those who threatened production. A memo from 1878 detailing the use of permanent corrective measures for workers who attempted to organize or complain about conditions. Then she found something that changed everything. A letter dated 1920, written by Catherine Holloway to her daughter, Margaret's grandmother. It was personal, anguished, the confession of a woman who had carried terrible knowledge for decades. "My dearest Elizabeth," it began, "I write this knowing I have not many years left, and I cannot go to my grave carrying this burden alone. You must know the truth about your father, about the fortune that has sustained our family for 40 years. It is built on blood and bones, on the lives of men treated as less than human, on crimes that would see us all imprisoned if justice truly existed in this world. In March of 1878, 6 men who worked at your father's mine dared to demand fair treatment. They had written a letter to the governor detailing the conditions at Bone Valley, the deaths that went unreported, the wages paid in scrip worthless anywhere but the company store, the children forced to work in darkness until their lungs filled with dust and their bodies failed. Your father and his partners could not allow that letter to be sent. They arranged for those 6 men, brothers all, to be taken into the mine under pretense of inspecting a new shaft. Once underground, the entrance was collapsed. Those men died in darkness, slowly, calling for help that would never come, while above ground their disappearance was recorded as desertion. I learned of this through Edmund's business partner, Charles Whitmore, who came to our home drunk one night, tormented by guilt. He confessed everything, thinking I was Edmund. When he realized his mistake, he begged me to forget what I had heard, to think of my children, my position in society, and God forgive me, I did. I kept silent. I allowed those men to remain buried in their unmarked grave. I accepted the wealth built on their murder. But I could not forget. Edmund had a photograph taken, insurance he called it, documentation that the deed was done. I found it in his desk after his death, along with a journal detailing the company's unofficial activities. I could not destroy these things, but neither could I make them public. So I hid them, sealed them away, hoping that someday, when our family no longer held power, when the principals were all long dead, someone might find them and tell the truth. Elizabeth, I do not know if that day will ever come, but I beg you, if you find these documents, if you uncover this terrible secret, do not bury it again. Let those 6 souls finally have justice, even if it means destroying our family's reputation. Some prices are too high to pay for peace. The letter was signed with Catherine's shaking hand and dated 2 weeks before her death. Sarah sat in the quiet study, holding the letter, tears streaming down her face. Catherine Holloway had known. She had carried the guilt for 4 decades, had tried in her own limited way to ensure the truth would eventually surface, and her descendants had honored that wish, preserving the documents through generations until they reached Margaret, who had finally decided the time had come for truth. But Margaret had died before she could act. The documents had gone to the Historical Society, where they might have been properly examined and the story told if someone had not intervened to steal them back into silence. Sarah photographed every document, every letter, every ledger entry. She uploaded them to multiple cloud storage accounts, sent copies to her personal email and to Marcus. If something happened to her, if the documents disappeared again, at least the evidence would survive digitally. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear the footsteps on the stairs until they were very close. She looked up to find Derek Sutton standing in the doorway of the study, his expression neutral and professional, a gun held loosely at his side. "Dr. Chen," he said calmly, "I'm afraid I need you to hand over your phone and any documents you've been photographing." Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "The estate lawyer is downstairs. If I scream, he'll hear." "Mr. Prescott is currently unconscious in the kitchen," Sutton replied. "Nothing permanent, just a mild sedative in his coffee." He'll wake up in a few hours with a headache and no memory of the past 30 minutes. Now your phone, please." Sarah stood slowly, her mind racing. The gun was real, and Sutton looked entirely comfortable holding it. This was a man who had done violence before and would do it again without hesitation if necessary. But killing her here in the Holloway mansion with an estate lawyer as a witness would be messy, hard to cover up. "Who hired you?" she asked. "Eleanor Whitmore?" A flicker of something crossed Sutton's face. Respect, perhaps. "Clever. Yes, the Whitmore family retains my services. They're concerned about certain historical revelations that might damage their reputation and philanthropic standing in the community. My job is to ensure that those revelations remain private. By stealing evidence, by threatening a historian doing legitimate research, by protecting my client's interests using whatever means proved necessary," Sutton corrected. "I don't make moral judgments, Dr. Chen. I solve problems, and right now you're a problem that needs solving." He raised the gun slightly, not quite pointing it at her, but making the threat clear. "Your phone. And then you're going to forget everything you found here. You're going to tell the Historical Society that the Holloway collection contained nothing of significance. You're going to move on to other research. And in return, you get to continue your life without any unfortunate complications. And if I refuse, then we'll have to discuss more permanent solutions to the problem." His tone remained conversational, as if they were negotiating a business deal, though I'd prefer to avoid that. Disappearances draw attention, and attention is bad for business. Much cleaner if you simply cooperate. Sarah's mind worked frantically. The documents were already uploaded to the cloud, but Sutton didn't know that. If she gave him her phone now, let him think he had contained the problem, she might buy time to figure out her next move. But before she could respond, another voice spoke from behind Sutton. "I'm afraid I can't let you threaten Dr. Chen." They both turned to see Marcus Williams standing in the hallway, his own phone held up, clearly recording. "I've been filming this whole conversation, Mr. Sutton. It's already being live-streamed to a private server. If anything happens to either of us, that footage automatically goes to the police, the FBI, and every major news outlet in Florida." Sutton's expression hardened. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Marcus asked. "You're welcome to test that theory. But I'd think carefully about what happens when a licensed security consultant is caught on video threatening a university researcher with a firearm. I don't think your other clients would appreciate that kind of publicity." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Sutton slowly lowered his gun, his face a mask of cold fury. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "My clients have resources you can't imagine. Legal resources, political resources. They can destroy your careers, your reputations. They can make sure no academic institution ever employs you again." "Let them try," Sarah said, her fear transforming into anger. "Because we're not backing down. Those 6 men deserve justice, and they're going to get it, no matter how many lawyers the Whitmore family throws at us." Sutton looked between them, calculating. Finally, he nodded slowly. "You've made your choice. Live with the consequences." He turned and walked down the hallway, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. Sarah and Marcus stood frozen until they heard the front door close. Then Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding and nearly collapsed into the desk chair. "How long have you been here?" she asked Marcus. "About 20 minutes. I got worried when you said you were coming here alone, so I followed you. When I saw that lawyer unconscious in the kitchen, I called the police, then came looking for you." He lowered his phone, hands shaking slightly. "That recording is real, by the way. It's uploading to 3 different servers as we speak." "Thank you," Sarah said. "You may have just saved my life. We need to leave. Now. The police are on their way, but I don't know if Sutton is working alone. There might be others." They gathered the original documents Sarah had found, carefully placing them in archival boxes to transport. As they hurried down the stairs, they could hear Mr. Prescott groaning in the kitchen, beginning to wake from the sedative. Outside, the morning had turned grey and threatening, heavy clouds rolling in from the ocean. They loaded the documents into Marcus's car, then waited for the police to arrive, giving statements about finding the lawyer unconscious and the intruder who had threatened them. Detective Morrison took their statements with growing incredulity. "You're telling me that a professional security consultant broke into a private home to steal historical documents related to a mining incident from 1878. "Not just any mining incident," Sarah said. "A mass murder. 6 men killed to silence their complaints about working conditions, and the families who profited from that murder have been covering it up for nearly 150 years. Morrison looked at the documents spread across the hood of his patrol car, the ledger entries, the letters, the confessions. His skepticism slowly gave way to something else, a recognition of the weight of what he was seeing. "If this is genuine," he said slowly, "if these documents prove what you say they prove, this is going to explode. The Whitmore family, they're major philanthropists. They fund half the cultural institutions in this city. Accusing them of covering up a century-old murder is exactly what we're doing," Marcus said firmly, "because it's the truth, and truth matters, even when it's inconvenient for powerful people." Morrison closed the folder containing Catherine Holloway's confession letter. "I'm going to need to take all of these into evidence, and I'm going to recommend that you both get protective custody until we can sort this out." "No," Sarah said. "We need to publish this story. Get it out into the public sphere where it can't be suppressed. Once it's public knowledge, the Whitmores won't gain anything from silencing us." "Dr. Chen, these people sent an armed man to threaten you." "And we have him on video making those threats," Marcus interrupted, "which means we have leverage. They can't touch us without exposing themselves to criminal prosecution." Morrison looked unhappy but nodded. "At least, let me post an officer outside your homes, and I want you to check in with me twice a day until this is resolved." They agreed, and Morrison left with the original documents, promising to have them examined by forensic experts to verify their authenticity. Sarah and Marcus drove to the Historical Society's office, where they spent the rest of the day drafting a comprehensive report detailing their findings. By evening, they had prepared a 70-page document with photographs of all the evidence, a timeline of events, and a clear accusation that the Consolidated Phosphate Trust, with the participation of the Holloway and Whitmore families, had murdered 6 labor activists in 1878 and successfully covered up the crime for nearly a century and a half. "Are we really doing this?" Marcus asked, as Sarah's finger hovered over the send button that would distribute their report to every major news outlet, historical journal, and civil rights organization they could find. "Those 6 men have been waiting for justice for 145 years, Sarah said. "We're not making them wait any longer." She pressed send. The story broke like a thunderclap across Florida's historical and social landscape. Within 24 hours, the report had been picked up by national news outlets. Within 48 hours, it had gone viral on social media, with hashtags like Justice for Mercer Brothers and Bone Valley Murder trending across platforms. The Whitmore family issued a statement through their lawyers, claiming the documents were forgeries, that Sarah and Marcus were engaged in a malicious campaign to damage their reputation. They threatened lawsuits, demanded retractions, mobilized their considerable influence to discredit the research. But the evidence was overwhelming. Forensic document examiners confirmed the authenticity of the ledgers and letters. Historians corroborated the timeline. Genealogists verified the family connections. And most devastatingly, a team of archaeologists requested permission to excavate the site of the old Bone Valley mine, based on coordinates mentioned in Edmund Holloway's private journal. Sarah and Marcus became the center of a media firestorm. Interview requests poured in from every major news network. Academic journals that had previously rejected Sarah's work now begged for articles. The governor of Florida called for a full investigation into historical labor practices in the state's mining industry. Through it all, Sarah received anonymous threats, messages warning her to retract the story, to apologize, to disappear. But she also received messages of support from historians, civil rights activists, descendants of mining families who had lost ancestors to the industry's brutal conditions. The truth, once released, had taken on a life of its own, becoming bigger than any individual or family could contain. 3 weeks after the story broke, Sarah stood at the edge of the archaeological excavation site in what had once been Bone Valley. The land had changed dramatically since 1878, forests replacing mines, suburbs encroaching on what had been industrial wasteland. But the archaeologists had identified the location of the original shaft, and after 2 weeks of careful excavation, they had found what remained of the collapsed entrance. Detective Morrison stood beside her, along with Marcus, representatives from the State Historical Commission, and a group of people who had traveled from across the country after discovering they were descendants of the Mercer brothers. The 6 men had not died without leaving traces. 2 had been married, had young children when they disappeared. Those children had grown up told that their fathers had abandoned them, had run off west, or died in accidents. Now their descendants finally knew the truth. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Helen Vargas, emerged from the excavation tent, her expression somber. "We've found remains," she said quietly. 6 individuals, based on preliminary examination. The site will need months of careful work to properly recover everything, but there's no doubt this was their grave. One of the descendants, a woman in her 70s named Patricia Mercer Johnson, began to cry. Her great-grandfather had been the youngest of the brothers, just 17 when he died. They were trapped down there, she said. All this time, trapped in the dark, and nobody came for them. Nobody even looked. "Someone looked," Sarah said gently. "Catherine Holloway looked. She kept the evidence, made sure the truth would survive, and Margaret Holloway made sure it finally came to light. It took nearly 150 years, but your ancestors are finally being acknowledged, finally getting the justice they deserved." The excavation continued through the spring. The remains of the 6 Mercer brothers were carefully recovered, studied, and finally given a proper burial in St. Augustine's Tolomato Cemetery, with full honors and a memorial service attended by hundreds. The governor spoke, acknowledging the state's failure to protect its workers, to investigate disappearances, to hold powerful corporations accountable. The Whitmore family's reputation lay in ruins. Their charitable donations were rejected by institutions that had once courted their support. Legal investigations into whether their fortune constituted the proceeds of crime began to wind through the courts. Eleanor Whitmore herself was charged with obstruction of justice for attempting to suppress historical evidence, and for hiring Derek Sutton, who faced his own criminal charges for assault and witness intimidation. But more importantly, the story of the Mercer brothers opened a door that had been sealed for too long. Across Florida and throughout the South, historians began investigating other disappearances, other labor disputes that had ended in mysterious deaths and convenient absences of documentation. The pattern emerged clearly. Powerful industries had routinely silenced workers who demanded basic rights, and had done so with the complicity of law enforcement and government officials who valued profit over human life. Sarah testified before a state commission on historical labor practices, her research forming the foundation for new educational initiatives and memorial projects. The Bone Valley Massacre, as it came to be known, became a touchstone for discussions about corporate power, workers' rights, and the importance of historical accountability. On a warm evening in June, Sarah and Marcus stood on the balcony of the Historical Research Center, looking out over the old city. The tourist crowds moved through the streets below, oblivious to the history beneath their feet, the struggles and crimes and acts of courage that had shaped the very ground they walked on. "Do you ever wonder if we did the right thing?" Marcus asked. "We destroyed a family's reputation, ended careers, brought pain to a lot of people. We told the truth," Sarah said. "That's all. The Whitmore family destroyed their own reputation by trying to hide that truth. And as for pain, what about the pain of those 6 men dying in darkness? What about their families, spending generations believing their loved ones had abandoned them? Some pain is necessary to heal old wounds." Marcus nodded slowly. "I suppose you're right. It just feels strange how one photograph, one box of old documents could change so much." "That's the power of preserved truth," Sarah said. Catherine Holloway understood that. She couldn't bring herself to expose the crimes in her lifetime, couldn't face the social consequences, couldn't imagine destroying her family's position. But she made sure the evidence survived. She had faith that someday someone would care enough to look, to dig, to refuse to let the past stay buried. And that someone was you. "No," Sarah said. "It was all of us. You, Tom Ramirez, Detective Morrison, Dr. Vargas, all the people who chose truth over comfort. That's what justice requires, people willing to be uncomfortable, to face unpleasant realities, to acknowledge that sometimes the institutions we trust, the families we respect, the histories we've been told, are built on foundations of exploitation and violence." They stood in silence for a while, watching the sun set over the city, its light painting the old buildings in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere out there, 6 men finally rested in peace, their names carved in stone, their story told, their sacrifice acknowledged. Sarah thought about freedom, about what it really meant. Not just political freedom or economic freedom, but the freedom that came from truth, from knowing the past honestly, from refusing to let power dictate what could be remembered and what must be forgotten. The 6 Mercer brothers had fought for the freedom to work in safe conditions, to be paid fairly, to be treated as human beings rather than expendable resources. They had been murdered for demanding that freedom, but their murderers had not won. The truth had survived, hidden in a photograph, preserved in documents, sealed away by a guilty conscience. And when that truth finally emerged, it had shaken the foundations of power that had seemed so permanent, so unassailable. "I've been thinking about what happens next," Marcus said. "There must be hundreds of stories like this, thousands maybe, all across the country, all through our history. Workers who disappeared, activists who were silenced, communities that were erased. And somewhere there are documents, photographs, evidence waiting to be found." "You're right," Sarah said. "This isn't an ending, it's a beginning. We've proven that even after 150 years, even when powerful families use all their resources to suppress the truth, justice can still prevail. That's a message that matters. That's a message that will inspire others to keep digging, keep questioning, keep refusing to accept the sanitized versions of history that make us comfortable." As the stars began to appear overhead, Sarah made a silent promise to the 6 Mercer brothers. Their story would not be forgotten. It would be taught in schools, studied in universities, memorialized in museums. Future generations would know their names, would understand their courage, would recognize that the freedoms workers enjoyed today had been built on the sacrifices of men like them. Men who had dared to demand basic human dignity and had paid for that demand with their lives. But more than that, their story would serve as a reminder that truth could not be buried forever, that evidence preserved with care and courage would eventually find its way to light, that the arc of history, however long and twisted, did bend toward justice, The photograph that had started it all hung now in the St. Augustine Historical Research Center, behind protective glass, properly conserved and documented. Thousands of visitors had already come to see it, to look into the faces of those 6 terrified brothers, to read the inscriptions that had survived against all odds. And in looking, in reading, in understanding, they were participating in an act of resistance against the forces that had tried so hard to make these men disappear. Sarah Chen had set out to be a historian, to preserve the past and make it accessible to future generations. She had succeeded beyond anything she could have imagined. But she had also become something more, an agent of justice, a voice for the silenced, a challenger of the comfortable narratives that allowed society to ignore uncomfortable truths. The Mercer brothers had been denied their freedom in life, but in death, through the dedication of people who refused to let them be forgotten, they had achieved something more powerful. They had become symbols of resistance, proof that every human life had value, that every injustice demanded acknowledgement, that truth, however long delayed, would ultimately prevail. As Sarah and Marcus finally left the balcony and returned to the quiet halls of the research center, the city below continued its evening rhythms, unaware that the ground beneath their feet had shifted, that the past had been reclaimed, that 6 men who had died in darkness had finally been brought into the light, and in archives and attics and sealed trunks across the country, other photographs waited, other documents preserved by other guilty consciences, other truths ready to emerge when someone had the courage to look, to question, to refuse to let the past stay buried. The work of justice was never finished. But tonight, for 6 brothers from Bone Valley, for their descendants who had waited generations for answers, for everyone who had suffered under the weight of hidden crimes, there was finally, at long last, a measure of peace. The truth had set them free.